So with no further ado, take it away, John.
Okay, well, thank you, everybody. Thanks for coming today. It's a glorious day, so I'll try and get this as quick as I can so we can all go back outside. That'd be nice, wouldn't it? So this one, the Secrets League, we say, we think, me and Kate were talking beforehand, we think it's the 11th one of the series. We're not sure, but we will keep them going. And this one, loosely entitled "Throw Away the Key." It's going to be a very brief history of Gloucestershire prisons and prisoners, partly because it's such a huge subject. But we'll start off with very early ones. And prior to the Tudor period, there was actually little need for prisons as such. And one of the reasons was that they're, on the face of it, they're quite expensive to build and also to run. If you've got a prison, you've got to pay jailers, you've got to keep prisoners fed. And at the time when kings really only collected taxes at wartime, it was beyond their means to do it. The exception to this were those people ordered to be detained by the crown, so royal prisoners, and in the county they were basically held in the dungeon of Gloucester Castle until a trial could be arranged. They could be held elsewhere, any sort of castle. The king could say, you know what, I want you to look after this prisoner for me. Another reason why prisons weren't needed was that if there were sort of trials, they usually took place very, very quickly. So people awaiting trial only had to be held for a short time, literally a day, if that sort of thing. So you could almost lock them up anywhere. So this is why these prisons weren't needed. And look at the crimes of the time. The typical crimes in the medieval period, pretty recognizable to us today. So this comes from some documents at the National Archives, a summary based on crime 1300 to 1348. So you've got basically theft, you've got murder, you've got receiving stolen goods, and then you've got a bunch of arson, counterfeiting coins, rape, treason, other crimes, quite small. So theft was the majority of it. And you can see the picture in the top left there, top right, I should say, and that is a typical example of how people were thieved from. This is a cut purse. So purses containing your money was usually attached to your belt, and then people would come along, just cut the strings. So that's a typical cut purse in operation. Punishments at this time revolved around sort of three main ones. Capital punishments. Now this was sort of the serious stuff, so arson, treason, counterfeiting coins, poaching. These were all deemed very serious offences as they technically damaged the sort of the land and property of the ruling classes. So punishments for these were typically harsh, usually execution, which was usually done by hanging. The more sort of interesting forms of execution were reserved to sort of the treasonous people, really, so the hang, drawn and quartering, that sort of thing. You also had corporal punishments. Now these were sort of deemed crimes for petty theft, which was theft of goods of under sort of 12pence, theft of crops, livestock, minor poaching, usually punished by corporal punishment. It's intended to stop other people doing it. The typical one was mutilation, so the removal of a body part, hand, ear, nose, feet, or castration. Again, we're not quite sure how often these were done, but it was one of the options they had. The most common ones really were the public humiliation ones. So, for just public disorder, disturbing the peace, drunkenness, prostitution, market crimes, that sort of thing. These were punished in the stocks, the cucking stool, which is the cucking stool is another name for a ducking school, and the pillory. And these were punishments that sort of involved physical pain, discomfort, and also public humiliation. And with the stocks and the pillory, people in there would be kept in there for several days, exposed to all the weather, and you could just, throw stuff at them as you walked by, sort of thing. Probably do lots of other rude things to them, I would think, as well. By far, though, the most common punishment in medieval times was simply a fine. So fines were paid, and the monies went to the crown. Previous to this period, they actually went to the people you offended. But that was the most common one, and most things, you'd be fined a couple of pence for, something like that. However, you did get some imprisonment, and it was, as I say, usually mostly for people awaiting trial, but it was also used to punish debtors and later vagabonds, and we'll look at those in a minute. So because there was no real requirement to keep prisoners, but there were a few exceptions. So you've got the town watchman. So from 1295 onwards, watchmen in town had the powers to arrest and detain people they encountered at night. And these places they used were sort of town gatehouses usually, which came to be known as lockups. And you'd keep the person there overnight. If they sobered up, you'd let them go. You might fine them, that sort of thing. These also happened in villages, and we've got some nice ones in Gloucestershire. So we've got got the one at Bisley, which probably most people have seen, I would think. Very small brick or stone buildings, 1 or 2 cells, just so the parish constable will throw the drunks in there and wait till they sobered up, then let them out. So Bisley is the one there. It's a very good one, but you've got others. Westerly is in the church tower. Cirencester is a nice one. Northleach is one. Biber is a very good one. It's hidden around the back of the Swan, so it's hard to find. The exception to the no imprisonment was the debtors' prison. So if you became a debtor, so you couldn't pay a bill or a fine, you would be locked up in the debtors' prison, which was known as the common jail. And from 1185, this was located in Gloucester Castle, which ceased to be maintained as a fortress in the 1450s, but it continued in use as the county jail. And at this time, the constable of the castle, who was the man who looked after the castle, he sort of morphed into the office of the county jailer. So apart from the keep, which was the main part and used as the jail, the rest of the castle pretty much fell into disrepair quite quickly after 1450. People are nicking stone for it, for everything, from city buildings and road repairs, everything. So, you know, from what was a beautiful, huge castle, you know, pretty soon you end up with just this one building left over. To the extent that by 1630, so with just a couple of 100 years, the entire curtain wall and the towers had gone, and they had to build a new wall around this surviving jail to determine the jail area. So you know, quite a sad end for our lovely castle. You know, if it had still been there today, it would have been wonderful. We don't know what the layout of the castle jail was. There's no plan survived for that. But you know, going by other debtors' jails, which they tended to be one large cell where all the debtors were held en masse until the families paid their debt. And the picture here comes from Nichols's The Forest of Dean book, and it shows the inside of St Bravel's Castle debtors' prison. So you get the idea. It's just literally one large room. Conditions inside, usually pretty bad. Prisoners often died of disease, typically typhus, which is jail fever, spread by lice. You know, and another thing about it is prisoners weren't fed. They only received food if they could pay for it, or if it was provided for them by their families. So many suffered from starvation, and not to mention abuse from other prisoners. That was rife. And this is a picture from Hogarth's The Rake's Progress, when the rake find himself in debtor's prison. Must have been horrific in there. Many debtors remained locked up for years because obviously if you couldn't pay a debt or you put inside of the debtor's jail, you couldn't work to make any money. It was up to your families to try and get you out. So, you know, it would then very often for families to fall into poverty as well. During the 16th century, there's a huge rise in poverty caused by several factors. Population growth is probably the most important one. Is by this time, believe it or not, the country had actually finally recovered from the Black Death. So the population had gone back to where it was at 1350 and was now starting to increase. This, of course, meant more competition for the jobs there were, which triggered inflation. There's also a sort of sequence of bad harvests at this time, and also agricultural changes. So an increase in sheep farming and a decrease in arable farming caused more unemployment. And of course, something we don't often think about here is the dissolution of the monasteries. They were huge employers in the countryside. So when they were dissolved, loads of people lost their jobs. And also, of course, they were also one of the main providers of charity at this time. So if they've gone as well, you've got a lot of people with no work and nowhere to turn to charity. What are they going to do? Well, they're going to head into the cities. So lots of people then tried to move out to the towns and cities to try and find work. And this became known as vagrancy. Because, you know, most vagrants came and said they couldn't find work, they were forced into begging for food and money. Others resorted to crime, and they were known as vagabonds or rogues. And then rising numbers, began to become quite a real concern for the Tudor monarchs, especially during Elizabeth's reign, when there was so much other upheaval going on as well. And they were dealt with in lots of various ways. Initially, if you were caught as a vagrant, you were put in the stocks in the pillory. Later, they were whipped out of towns. And the picture here is a woodcut of a Tudor vagrant being whipped out of town. Some were even branded with a V on their foreheads for vagrants, you know. Others were imprisoned. But so you get this situation where genuine travellers, typically musicians or players from companies, had to procure themselves licenses to protect themselves from being punished in this way. So to cope with the increase in vagrants, vagabonds and beggars, the borough kept several small jails in the town in Gloucester, which were distinct and separate from the old castle, the common jail. We know that the two gatehouses were in use by 1485. The North Gate was the main prison, while another, which we think was probably the East Gate, was used to house female prisoners by 1560. We also know that in 1590, a new jailers' lodging was built on the east side of the North Gate, and that was partly financed with 20 marks, given by Richard Pate of Pate's Grammar, and that he'd given this money to help repair the city gates, but the city used it to build a jailer's house on the side of it. And this is a map, an image of the North Gate from the Speeds map. So, you know, it's a very stylish one. You can't really see any in detail there. We know the North Gate seems to have fallen out of use by around about 1613, when the East Gate became more important. And this was especially after 1707, when it was used as what they called the Bridewell, or the House of Correction. And it was used as that until it's on and off, I should say, until its demolition in the late 1700s. So the Bridewell, the Houses of Correction, well, these all came from an Act of Parliament in 1576, when Parliament ordered the county quarter sessions, who were the forerunners of the county council, like today, ordered them to raise money to build houses of correction, or Bridewells. And this was actually the start of the prison system that we are so familiar with today. They were named after the old royal palace of Bridewell in London, which by this time, 1570, had been turned actually into a workplace for the poor. So they based their idea on this: we can put all the poor and vagabonds into one of these places, and then keep them contained. Then to technically describe the reformation of idle and disorderly persons, and it's thought by setting them to work, actually like more workhouses for the poor, which we'll actually look at next month, they were used for the imprisonment of all these offenders, you know. So in Gloucestershire, we've got Bridewells at the following places: Gloucester, Berkeley, Cirencester. Then they realised they needed a couple more, so they built some at Winchcombe and Lawford's Gate. So that's scattering across the county. It's a rather large map for 4 little dots, 5 little dots, but it's difficult to get the scale in otherwise. So the Gloucester Castle, it was known, the Bridewell was known as the Bridewell of the new brick building, to distinguish it from the common jail, which was known as the stone building. Now, in this picture, we think the Bridewell is the building on the left. You can see the building on the right, which is the buttress keep. Attached to it on the left is what we think is the Bridewell. We're not sure. We've not got any plans of this, but this sort of extension to the old jail appears, around about this time. So we're pretty sure it is the Bridewell. However, in 1707, for some reason, they built this structure. They moved it all back to the city's East Gate, and it was to be shared with the city and the county to keep it distinct from the common jail for the benefit of the public. But again, for some reason, this arrangement didn't last. And so by the late 1700s, the Bridewell moved back to the castle. So it's a very confusing time for this sort of Gloucester prison and the jail there. We're not quite sure exactly when and where things are happening. Oh. Doing go away. That's better. There we go. Interesting thing is, this chap visited the jail in 1683. It said, "It is esteemed the best in England. So if I were forced to go to prison, I would make my choice. I would come hither." So the jail at the time must have been fairly decent, I suppose. And we know that in some respects it was better than other jails. Because it was enclosed by this big wall, the prisoners had ample fresh air, lots of exercise. And inside the walls, there's a flower garden, which we know is maintained by the jailer's wife. And there's also a bowling green there, which was used by inhabitants of the city and also by the jailer and prisoners. So again, it's one of these things that, was it a prison, or is it something a little bit more than that? So it's a bit strange. The whole area was further enhanced in the 1740s, when the constable of the castle, or the jailer then as he was known, Benjamin Hyatt, big name in Gloucestershire, he actually laid out an ornamental garden on the castle grounds just to the east and to the south of the jail. So again, this jail, as things go, this jail was probably okay, I would think. So we look on to the city jail, the city prison. In 1788-81, following an Act of Parliament, the city was able to build a new jail purposely for the city prisoners, not the county prisoners, and it's been in Southgate Street, just south of St Kinniburgh's Chapel Hospital. This is actually to the south of where Southgate was, and we'll look at a better plan of this in a moment. But it was built with separate cells on the lines advocated by the prison reformer John Howard, but we know it did have this black hole, which I've circled there in red, which we think is probably an isolation cell, but we're not sure. Around 1816, it was enlarged to the west, which in this image is to the north, and a house of correction was built to it. The term house of correction, jail and prison, they seem to be sort of interchangeable. You're never quite sure which one's which. We also get the penitentiary thrown into this as well, which again, doesn't help to make it any clearer. This also had a treadmill, which we'll look at a little bit later on. And then by 1817, a police office was also tacked onto the building, presumably to house at the time the city's 12 constables and the official city watch. So this is a zoom up view of it, and I'll just put that. This is where it's roughly located, so just on the end of Southgate Street. And while I just having a look at that, I'll just have a quick slurp, like Keith Lord used to say. But it is coffee and not wine, sadly, he says. So you look at this prison, it's quite a nice view. It's got lots of decent sort of rooms in it. So we've got various yards. We've got debtors yard, felons yard, females yard, males yard, day rooms, drying yard, kitchen. So there's a lot of stuff there. Trouble is, we know it looks like it was a two-story building, but we don't have a plan of the upper floor or what cellars there were underneath it. Also of interest is there is a condemned cell there. So we're fairly sure the city did carry out executions here rather than at the main county jail. And again, we'll look at these in a minute or so. But it's quite a nice structure. Sadly, again, it's not there. We've lost so much of our heritage in Gloucester. It's very, very sad. So a quick look at the typical inmates in the city jail. So this is a page from the register of the city jail. We have some jail registers for all the county's prisons, and this is one for the jail. They're fairly well written. They're usually easy to read. Obviously, to the size of them, they're quite big. It's difficult to see them there. But there's a rich vein of offences on this one page. So we've got theft, prostitution, keeping disorderly house, there's an assault, there's failure to provide sureties for a warrant, there's a failure to appear at a court, there's sodomy, misbehaviour towards the master, which is done by an apprentice, leaving the master, again done by an apprentice, running away from the workhouse, and also vandalism. So vandalism isn't new. This person broke 6 panes of glass. So they tended to be punished by a range of things. So you had imprisonment, basically, with or without fine, and that imprisonment could range from 1 to 6 months. You can be fined as well, and again, the fines on this page go from a 6pence to a guinea. Also, there's flogging on here, and also there's being privately whipped. Now, we think this is probably different. Flogging was probably done publicly. Privately whipped was probably done privately inside the jail, but it's not. We're not certain on that. This is a picture by the mid 1800s. I can't see the top of the page at the moment. The actual it began to become too full. Its security, its sanitation was all starting to sort of run down. It's getting very poor. So it was decided to close it down. It was closed down in 1858. In this image, which is from the 1851 Board of Health map for Gloucester, again, it's another nice image, shows the extent of it nicely. It's a little bit fuzzy though, because if you need to see it, you can look at it on Know Your Place, this map, but you can't get into the very intimate detail, sadly. Now we come to the new jail. So in 1777, the reformer John Howard, he visited the old county jail and produced a very, very unfavourable report on it. And in 1783, it was taken up by George Onesiphorus Paul, who'd become an interesting chap. He was a bit of a wayward lad, but when he inherited his father's estate, he actually settled down and he took an interest in prisons, especially in reform. So he began promoting the idea of reforming and rebuilding the jail along Howard's lines. He was very, very good at this. So just within 2 years, he obtained an act of parliament authorising the county magistrates to build a new jail, and they purchased the site off the Hyatt family. Obviously, when they bought it at the castle, sort of thing. So this is why our sort of jail today, or the old jail, is underneath the old castle. Demolition of the castle keep began in 1787, and the new jail, designed by William Blackburn, was completed in 1791. So very quick build. Cost almost £50,000, and the first inmates we know were transferred into it on the last Friday in July 1791. This is the picture of its layout from the Hall and Pinnell map of 1780, so it's 10 years earlier, so it did change a little bit. I mean, you can see the base. It's like an H layout. We'll look at that again a little bit better in a second. We've got this lovely picture of it, the Gloucester County Jail. This is taken in 1795, and this is looking from sort of the southeast towards the actual northwest. So it's looking towards the May Hills there on the left. You can just see, but for a big structure, you can see why it costs nearly 50,000. To build that very quickly within 4 years is quite impressive. I don't think you'd get the same sort of thing done today, but it's a lovely building. Again, we'll see its demise. You can't see much of its shape there, which we'll look at otherwise in a moment. This is the view of the inside of it, the penitentiary, and this is where the most dangerous inmates were held, usually those condemned, or those who were sort of reprieved, or those awaiting transportation. And again, this is another famous image. Again, it's very hard to marry this up precisely with where we are in the building, because they don't show the offences, sadly. It's in one of the side wings. So it's probably that we think it's probably the visiting yard or the mail yard, that one was. But it was arranged 3 stories, divided into 3 quadrangles, which seems odd because quad's 4, but there you go. So it housed the jail, the penitentiary, and the house of correction. There's also a debtors prison, you can see, built later on. Initially held about 207 prisoners, divided according to gender and the crimes. 1826, the perimeter walls were extended east towards the Barbican Road, and the debtors' prison was built there. Also, the new gatehouse, which is the top right black blob there. If you ignore the big long black blob, that wasn't there then. But also it had another sort of wall opening the Castle Lane approach. This is a picture of it from the 1840 map. And again, you can see how big it was compared to what it was. So obviously crimes on the increase, or at least people being sent to prison on the increase. This is another view of it, again, from the 1852 Board of Health map. There was a lot more rebuilding going on. So the main rebuild produced what we see as this structure on the right hand side there. So you've got the debtors prison on the far right, and you've got the new wing here. It incorporated the original gatehouse. It was linked to the old jail by a chapel. The gatehouse, as you can see at the top left, also extended. And one of the aspects of the prison at this time is it does get a lot of rebuilding. There are things added to it nearly all the time. I don't know if we know a precise sequence of this, but it increased the number of cells at this time. If they liked the individual cells, so went from 143 to 489, which is quite a lot of prisoners in there. You can imagine the conditions probably weren't ideal, to say the least. Again, so many additions to this thing. The most notable, which we've probably all seen, is the addition of the Governor's House, which is on the perimeter wall of the Commercial Road, 1863. It's still there today. A lovely building. Would you want to sort of, as a governor, would you want to be back onto the jail? I don't know if you would, but they did. But anyway, long story short, after the Prisons Act 1877, control of the jail passed on the county magistrates who'd administered it since time immemorial to the Home Office, and that's when the site became HM Prison in Gloucester. And again, it's characterised by an awful lot of redevelopment over the years, but in 2013, prison was closed, decommissioned, and the site was made available for redevelopment. And of course, that's a whole nother story. It's still ongoing, what's going to happen to it. There's a really good history of the prison called History of Gloucester Prison, 1791 to 1950 by Jill Evans. It's a really good book. If you're interested in the history of this prison, thoroughly recommend you get it and have a read. And we've got copies in the archives or these local libraries. Other county prisons, as well as building Gloucester Jail, and this is for us, Paul was able to get 4 new houses of correction built in the county: North Leach, Lawfordsgate, Littledean and Horsley. Only Littledean, which is now a museum, survives intact, although the front of North Leach is still complete. So we've got Little Dean at the top there, which is, I'm sure again we've all seen that. It's a beautifully imposing, lovely building. The bottom is North Leach. That isn't the surviving part. This is the part we've lost, and it's the front of the building which we've actually kept now. So again, it's still worth a visit if you go to North Leach, because they still have cells and a courtroom from later times, but it's well worth a visit if you've not been before. There's a great little cafe in there, Cotswold Lion, thoroughly recommend it. Lawford's Gate, as far as I know, I've not found any images of it. We haven't got one in the archives, but it was largely destroyed by fire in the 1831 Bristol riots. There's good information on that on the Bristol Archives website. And it was finally pulled down in 1926. Horsley was demolished by 1878. And again, there's very little information or very little in the way of images on Horsley, sadly. It would be nice to see what it really looked like. All of these were similar to Gloucester, but they were all smaller, and again they were intended to be run with the intention of fulfilling current modern ideas on prison life, with regards to provision of work, controlled diets, health and religious education. So these were really reformed buildings, and conditions inside must have picked up when these new places were built. Tewkesbury, that's the only other place in Gloucestershire to run its own jail. Prior to 1816, the actual jail was in the lower part of the belfry of Abbey Church. I don't know exactly whereabouts in there. I've yet to find that out. But after an Act of 1813, the borough built a new jail on Bredon Road, which by 1830 had 82 inmates, climbed 235 in 36, 37, but then the 1841 census dropped it right back down to 11 inmates. And this is a picture of it. It closed in 1854, after which the Tewkesbury prisoners were sent to the County Gaol at Gloucester, and the building became the town police station, which is, it's not the police station anymore, but it's still extant. You can still see it. So this is a quick look at some of the records that we have for these places today. They're a varying type of things, some original documents, some printed. The jail calendars, these are printed ones, and they give you lists of prisoners mostly awaiting trial, not always, in all the jails and houses of correction in the county. They give the name, prisoner's name, date committed, the offence. All of them have been digitised and indexed by Ancestry now, up into including 1913, and that's supposed to be a rolling figure, I think. I'm not sure how often they update it. For the county jail, which is the sort of the main prison, these are probably the most common ones. We've got some wonderful registers. We'll look at an example later on. So we've got registers of awaiting trial, prisoners' registers, prisoners' photographs. Now, we don't get these out at the moment because years ago, long before we had control of it, somebody actually snipped photos out of this, sadly. So it's something we hold as very precious now. So you've got to have a very good reason to see it. Having said that, if you're interested in prisoners' pictures, Liz Jack has done a very good book on it. I can't remember what the title is. It's similar, like Prisoners in Gloucester Jail, I think. So again, thoroughly recommend you have a look at that one. We've got a copy of it at the archives, or say local libraries. We've also got registers of convictions, debtors registers, and the penitentiary registers. Again, I'm not quite sure what the difference was between the jail, prison, and penitentiary. I've not been able to find that out. But we've got a lot of other records for the county jail. So governors' journals, chaplains' journals, surgeons' journals, and you've got a few records relating to prison staff, but not very many. The other thing to remember if you want to look at these is everything less than 100 years old is closed, so you can't see them. Looking around in the county, other county jails, again, a fair range of records have survived. Luckily, these have come through for us from the quarter session, so they were quite well kept. Only the registers have been digitized by Ancestry. So all the other things you need to sort of come in, find the number and come in and order them, view them in the archives. So for example, Little Dean's probably the best one. So we've got registers, justices' journals, minute books, order books, day books, journals, dietary books, property books, chaplains' journals, medical diaries, matrons' journals, schoolmasters, because obviously young kids in there at the time, day books, surgery books. So it's a vast amount of stuff there. And again, the same goes on for the rest of them, except for Lawford's Gate, where a lot of it was lost at the time when the prison was burned. Fewer records survive for the borough jails. So we've only got sort of one register of prisoners for Gloucester. We've got a property book, which is quite interesting, and we've got a list of prisoners awaiting trial. For Tewkesbury, even less. We've basically just got a one register of prisoners in the jail. But again, these, you know, if you've got somebody you know is in that area, you know, you can have a look. Again, these are all on Ancestry. I do forget which way round it is. Whenever I go on to look at these records on Ancestry, you get prison registers and you get jail records, and I always go for the wrong one. So it's on one of them. I can't remember what it is precisely, but it's on one of them. So looking at prison food and things here, interesting. Oxford martyrs, Archbishops Cranmer, Latimer and Ridley, when they were imprisoned by the Crown in 1554, they actually received food to the value of £3 per week, which was a fortune back then. And there is a very good paper online which you can look at, JSTOR Journal, which is available to view at the moment. It gives you, there's records actually surviving what they had, and it's quite interesting reading, but that's a huge amount of money for the time. Most other prisoners fared much less well. As I mentioned earlier, if you were in the debtors prison, you depended on your family for food, or you had to pay for it yourself. And of course, the jailers would make the profit out of this. So, you know, if you gave them you know, threepence, you only got probably a penny's worth of food. So again, it's a bit of a con for them at the time, but that's how they made their living. So if you were wealthy, you could fare really better. You could get decent food, you could get visits from lawyers, priests, physicians, families, friends, charity officials, business partners, and there are even cases of prostitutes coming in. You can sort of hire yourself a room with a prostitute for half an hour. You know, so if you're wealthy, you could do all this. The odd one thing is, if you're wealthy, what are you doing in a debtor's prison? Well, you've been declared bankrupt, but your family might not be. That's the trick there. In the county jail, in the early days, lots of prisoners were fed by charity with requests from wills or something, providing doles of bread, for example, or cheese. But by the late 1700s, the reforms had resulted in prisoners being much better fed regularly and with better food, and actually prison diet. And this is a lovely document we have. This is a prison dietaries. There's various scales involved. So basically, if you're a class A prisoner, you were in prison for under 10 days. If you're a class B prisoner, you were in prison over 10 days. So you could get various amounts of food, and it's quite a lot of food you're getting. You know, okay, it's very bland, it's very monotonous. It is bread, it's gruel, that sort of thing. But it's good enough in the fact that you can, you know, you're going to keep fed. If you ended up doing hard labor, you get extra food, that sort of thing. And I'll just give you a quick look at that for a moment. We've got another one coming, just so I have another slurp. So with all this, you know, at least when you're in prison now, you're getting something to eat and you're not relying on sort of whatever there is. Again, if those of you who've looked at workhouses and the poor laws, which I think I might mention this, we are doing next month, so please do come along to next month's talk. You'll see another example for workhouses. They are very, very similar in what the sort of the workhouses and the prisoners are getting. Here's another one, which is probably a little bit more advanced, a little bit later, but you see here there are lots of different classes here. So, for example, the one I can see from this distance, class 5, convicted prisoners employed at hard labour for terms exceeding 3 months. So, you know, you get a breakfast, you get a dinner, you know. That's all you need, really, isn't it? What he says as he's thinking about his stomach rumbling at the moment. But again, really interesting bits of paper. You can see all these in the archives. Rules, regulations, like all of us, prisoners were subjected to rules and regulations governing their behaviour. Punishments could be harsh, including the isolation, treadmill, and flogging. Got another couple of slides showing the detail of this, but basically this regulation. So basically the rules were rise at 5:45 in the summer, 6:45 in winter. You had half hour for breakfast, hour for dinner, half hour for supper, and work finished 8 p.m. In between that time, you had to look after your cell, clean it all up, do whatever work you had to do. Interestingly, Gloucester Jail turned out to be notoriously cold. In 1801, there are actually experiments undertaken to provide central heating via underground flue systems. So it'd be interesting when the archaeologists get into the jail, the jail at the moment, when they redevelop it, whatever it's going to be redeveloped into, whether they find evidence of any of these things. So the next couple of slides, I'll just zoom in on there, and I'll let you have just a little bit of time for having a quick read of it. one of the most interesting things of this is they are very twitchy about prisoners' hats. They're called the caps, so they have to look after them. Don't quite know why this was. We know there was a uniform, which we'll see in a minute in the prisoners section, but you really odd. There is a lot of interesting information about these caps they had to wear. But you can interesting things like one rule there: you have to sleep in their sheets and not in the blankets, and you have to place the sheet over the pillow in order to keep the pillow clean, which implies you're not getting a lot of washing of the sort of these things. So this is what you are to do, okay, and this is what you are not to do. And again, this is where the caps thing. So not to wear their caps in their cell, unless in their cell. I don't know why the caps are so important, I have to say. Interestingly, in the chapels and things, they all actually had individual seats, rather like pews. And you'd go into your individual cell, you'd hang your number on it to show you were there. And when you left, you had to take your number away. I do like to say that the prisoners are not to attempt to escape, which is there. Nor in such incite anybody else to escape. Okay, again, as always, this talk will go up online later on, so you can go to it and have a good look at it. Prison work, basically, it's repetitive, dull, and quite hard. It was seen as a punishment, but it was also used by the prison authorities to try and make some money to offset the costs to help run the prison. The hardest work was reserved for those who are on hard labour, so the classic one is breaking rocks for use on roads. But other work included sewing mailbags, making hammocks for the Navy, cleaning, laundering, gardening, and other sort of labouring. We've not got a lot of information on whether prisoners in this country were let out in the chain gangs like they were in the United States. I imagine they were, but quite how this was run, I don't know. So I've not found anything on that yet. If you were a female prisoner, you mostly worked in the laundry, or you repaired clothes, or you made stockings. You weren't actually given sort of the harder rock breaking jobs like the men were. One of the most common tasks was picking oakum. Now, this is where you had short lengths of rope, and you'd actually unravel all the fibres, and you'd get basically a ball of fibre, which was then used for caulking on ships, or it could be remade into rope. And this was again a common task with the workhouses. The Navy always needed caulking on ships, so it's really important. It was mixed with tar and stuff like that. And again, long days, 8 hours a day, just doing this sort of thing. I've done it as practice to show people what it's like at events, and it's really quite hard work, and it does hurt your fingers. And of course, all this was also done in silence. There was no talking allowed, so it couldn't have been very nice. It must have been very, very hard work. The treadmill, along with its lesser known one, the hand crank. So the hand crank was a machine that sat upright with two handles. You literally just had to turn it all day. The treadmill was very similar. It was used as a method of punishing prisoners. They were introduced in 1818. Took the form of basically like a large paddle wheel on a ship. Wheels are usually about 20 feet in diameter, 24 steps around a 6-foot cylinder. So it's, again, and you literally just got in it and you walked. One was installed in Gloucester Jail in 1823, not for any nasty reason, but it's primarily because they couldn't find enough work for prisoners sentenced to hard labour to do. What you've got to remember is that if you were breaking rocks, the rocks had to be brought into the prison. Of course, that cost money. And this was something the prison authorities didn't really want to waste if they couldn't avoid it. So if you're out like Little Bean, it's easy. You can just go around the corner and there's the hills there you can break rocks into, and then Cinderfoot. But in places where there's nothing to do, you've got to find some of the prisoners. So this is why the treadmill's stored. And I think this picture does come from inside Gloucester Jail. It comes from the Gloucestershire Police Archives. And I think it does show the treadmill in Gloucester Jail. So prisoners are on this for 6 hours a day, or working on it for 6 hours a day, climbing the equivalent of 5,000 to 14,000 feet. So it must have been very, very repetitive and dull. You couldn't stop moving, obviously. You had to keep going, if only because you're thinking, I'm going to get my legs trapped underneath me. So it must have been hellish, real hellish work. While we think of it as being mainly punitive, these treadmills actually often had a physical purpose. So they could be used to grind grain, they could be used to pump water, or to operate ventilation systems. And certainly the pumping water was one where they could pump water up to the top of the jail so they could have running water in the jail. As time passed, they did fall out of favour for reasons we'll see in a second. In the 4 smaller Paul jails in the county, so Northleach, Lawfordsgate, Horsley and Littledean, there wasn't, of course, any room to build these treadmills inside. So very often what they did is they actually drew them up as external buildings, added an external building in the courtyard. And this is the top part. It shows you plans of the one that was going to be installed at Northleach. In 1840, so a little bit later after if it's done there, and the image comes from it's a woodcut from London showing you what this would have looked like. So again, this would have been an open one because then you're exposed to the air, so it's colder. So in many ways, you probably want to be on the actual treadmill. And this is a lovely quote from the Gloucester Journal. A chap went around looking at it, and again, it's a really interesting little bit. While some were clinging by their hands working on the wheel, others were collected in the yard walking around in a weary round to escape catching cold and stretch their legs. Every now and then, as the wheel revolved, a whitened step appeared, and one of the workers would drop down, one of the walkers would get up, so the wheel and the punch was kept moving. Not a word was spoken on the wheel or off it, nor was it necessary, for each prisoner knew the moment that his spell ceased so accurately that he who turn and come had no opportunity of forgetting it. One could not fail to be struck by the air of languor and almost misery, which always marks labour lightened by reward. And that journalist really had to go there, didn't he? Interestingly, because of advantages in technology, they weren't the best. They eventually can be not the best way to do the jobs they've been used are, and they were just typically seen as a punishment rather than anything else. And they were eventually banned in 1902. A quick look at executions. In 1812, an MP said, "There is no country on the face of the earth in which there are or have been so many different offences according to law to be punished with death as in England." At its height, there are nearly over 220 crimes punishable purely by death. Prior to 1792, executions in Gloucestershire, or Gloucester, took place on Alney Island near the village of Over, where the gallows was built on the west bank of the island. And the condemned were taken there across the causeway in carts, sitting on their own coffins. Huge crowds would come and watch these. For the execution of William Crewe, one of the highwaymen, there is something, I think it was something that recorded like 20,000 people coming to watch him being executed. This is a zoom in, and it looks like this was a classic Tyburn tree. So it's a horizontal wooden triangle with 3 legs, known as a 3-legged mare or 3-legged stool, and it is simply done to permit mass executions. Tyburn gallows apparently once had 24 prisoners executed in one fell swoop there. We don't know if there is anything like that in Gloucester. I've not looked at the records. I suspect Gloucester, you might get 3, 4 at a maximum, something like that, maybe 2 per thing, so maybe 6, but certainly not. I wouldn't have thought you'd get 24. After the new jail was built, all the public hangings, of course, they were all public then. They were carried out from gallows on the gatehouse roof, which is circled at the top there. That was continued when the new gatehouse was built in 1826. We know that between 1792 and 1864, 102 hangings took place. There was 94 men and 8 women. But there was a gap then and no executions from 1839 and 1864. Things then resumed. I guess they just weren't hanging people then. After 1868, subsequent executions took place inside jail when public hangings were banned. And we know a further 17 people were executed, 16 men and a woman, between 1872 and 1939 when the last execution took place. If you get a chance to go to prison one of the open days today, this is an image from Geograph. It shows the end of the A-wing block, and the shed was located on the right-hand side, the execution shed on the right-hand side of the brickwork. You can just barely make out a faint change in the line. If you look at the black door there, or the black open door just above it, you can see the brick changes colour. There's redder brick on the right and paler on the left. Sorry, other way around. Paler on the right, darker on the left, and that's sort of the outline of the execution shed. It was demolished in 1966. And again, we have a listing, a book in the archives doing the executions again, if you want to read it. Burials it's a bit confusing. We're not knowing for certain what happened to the bodies of criminals, executed criminals prior to the 1750s. The tradition is that usually a body was gibbeted close to its scene of the crime, and gibbeted is when after the hanging you just put the body in an iron cage and let it rot there until you need the cage again. Alternatively, they might be buried in an unmarked grave, which again, there's not the information we know about it. After 1752, the Murder Act ordained the bodies of executed murderers should be sent to the local infirmary for dissection. And again, we have the reward of cruelty's wonderful plate by engraving by William Hogarth. I especially like the dog at the bottom there, finding something to enjoy. This, however, rescinded after the 1852 Anatomy Act, when executed murderers were to be buried inside the prison in unmarked graves. So, you know, I'm pretty sure there are some bodies there inside Gloucester Gaol somewhere. Criminals executed for other crimes, however, could be taken away by their friends and the family, buried where they wished, and that was usually in the local parish church. If they were sent for dissection, they then could be collected afterwards and by the family, and you know, when the infirmary had finished with them. And we know this happened with the Berkeley poachers, the famous Berkeley poachers, John Allen and John Penny, who were executed on the 13th of April 1816 for their part in the Great Berkeley Poaching Affray, which again is if you go on to the Dr. Jenner's house, there's recently been a good article on it on there. We know that after the execution, they looked like they were taken straight to the infirmary, dissected very, very rapidly. For the bodies were collected and they were buried at Thornbury just a day later. And this is a page from the Thornbury burial register, and you can see the names there: John Allen and John Penny, number 3 and number 4 down the thing. So, you know, you would hate to say it, but you wonder how many bits they were in when they were buried. You know, it's quite scary. Most prisoners, the best sort of information we have in the jail registers, this is you won't be able to see this, this is a big page, they're great big books about almost 1.5 foot sort of high and about sort of 2 foot wide. So they read across, but they include a lot of information, what they've done, age, abode, physical appearance, etc., etc. I've just got a couple here, just showing you one person. This is Charles Aston, age 14. He was a boatman, committed on 22nd of January 1850 for the theft of a handkerchief, a loaf of bread and £2 of cheese, the property of William Matthews. He got 6 weeks hard labour and was released in February. And you see how good they are. So it describes him. You know, he's 5'1", light hair, grey eyes, oval face, flesh complexion, got a tattoo. We can see, you know, what his crime was, what he was like in there. It does seem, this case is quite interesting actually, because it seems like William Matthews was a new solicitor who'd come into Gloucester. It looks like he deliberately left these things on a wall, knowing that somebody would actually steal them. And then he had men at either end of the street. He lived down by the cathedral. He'd come out and catch them, basically so he could make a name for himself in the city. So it's a little bit, you know, a bit of a tough one, this. Sometimes we get information from the records. This is a nice one for medical information. Apothecary's Journal for North Leach. Regular visits to inspect prisoners and treat them if necessary. This is a nice one. This is from Gilling North Leach. Thomas Charles, the apothecary, found the prisoner William Dyer was suffering from constipation, so he was given the warm bath and received opening pills and mixture. And all these treatments were paid for by the county court sessions, and they were paid for reasonably well, we believe. He visited again and found a couple of gents here. I thought William Barford, with swelling and inflammation in his groin and thigh. So he would give them medicine to help try and clear this up. And these journals are full of these sorts of visits. Sometimes you do get some prisoners need more medical attention. This is a especially interesting one. Deals with a prisoner called Jeremiah Harhally, who appears to be recovering from some sort of medical procedure. He's got a wound, but the apothecary repeatedly visits and prescribes more oatmeal, dresses the wound, but Halley does deteriorate, and it seems like he had some sort of infection. Now, I've not actually had a chance to look to see if Halley died or if he survived on this, but again, you can find this sort of information in some of the journals. You also get lots of broadsheets, and this is a particularly nice one. It's the Gloucester Bastille, pathetic particulars of a poor boy sentenced to suffer 7 years solitary confinement in Gloucester Jail. We haven't got time to go into it, but it's quite an interesting one. But again, I love that image there, the sort of the evil jailer and the poor boy pleading his safety. Probably one of the most famous prisoners is Kidwake. 1791, the British government, worried about the French Revolution, suspended what they called the habeas corpus in the country, so allowing agitators to be in prison without trial. A number of Gloucester had a number of political prisoners, and the most famous was King Wait. He'd basically been in a crowd and shouted, "No king, no war," as George III's carriage went by in London, and he was arrested, sentenced 5 years hard labour. He was kept at Gloucester for the first 3 months. He was actually put in the pillory in the marketplace for the first 3 months of his term. So, you know, it must have been quite tough. And this is the picture of the sort of the penitentiary uniform, the yellow and blue uniform that the prisoners in the penitentiary had to wear. We don't know whether this extended to the county jail or not. We just don't know that. Coming towards the end of the talk in a minute, I've just got some photographs of, photographs of prisoners. So the first records were taken unofficially by governors in the 1850s, but in 1871, it became a routine thing to take them. So we've only got 4 to look at, because there are just so many. And again, Liz Jack's done a wonderful book on this, but I think it's called Prisoners in Gloucester. She's gone through them and taken images and done biographies for them. But these are just a few. This is a few of them. So we only got 4 to go. So this is the oldest male we found. This is William Lord. He's aged 79. He is convicted in October 1860. I can't see the number there. Might be a 9. But 6 months hard labour for the theft of timber at Kempsford. Now, 79. Did he survive 6 months hard labour? Don't know. Hard to know, isn't it? He looks looks quite a decent chap, if you ask me. Like old face chops. Here we go. This is Grace here. She's again age 62, 6 months hard labour for stealing a skirt from a laundry where she worked. So again, she was taken in imprisoned. Looks very sad, doesn't she? This is the youngest, this is Sarah Jordan, only 12 years old, 6 weeks hard labour and 5 years into reform school. The crime, attainment of a pan of broth with intention to deform. Look at the dates, November, it's cold, it's wet. She's gone into to one of the restaurants in Gloucester, got a bowl of soup without the means to pay in it. Horrific. And probably the best one of all, here he is, Lydia Edgar Kilminster, sentenced, age 7, sentenced to 12 strokes of the birch rod and 7 days hard labour for stealing sweets in 1870. Interestingly, he was actually imprisoned with his older brother, who actually does look a real villain, I have to say. But I mean, look at that, isn't it terrible? He's going to be in the sentence just for stealing some sweets. And the last little slide, this is interesting. After the Norman conquest, going right back here, to deter Saxon communities from their continued habit of lopping off the old Norman, Normans imposed heavy fines on any village where a dead body was discovered on the assumption that it was presumed to be Norman and this could be proved to be English. This fine was known as murderum, and this is where the word murder comes from. There's a little start of a 10 for you there for your next thing. So that's the end of the talk. Hope you've enjoyed it. It's a longer one than last week, but I will quickly draw your attention. Don't forget our next talk, 27th of April. It's Secrets Revealed. The poor are always with us. So we'll be looking at all aspects of poor relief, overseers, the workhouses, etc. And if you have any children or grandchildren, don't forget, we do family-oriented presentations as well. And the next one is on the 6th of April. It's Passport to the Past, and it's growing up in the wartime, and they are really good fun. People really enjoy them. So thank you for the talk. Please, if you've got any questions, please do ask.
Yeah, thank you very much, John.
That was stop my share.
Excellent. So I put the name of Liz Jack's book into the chat, and it's called
brilliant.
Prisoners of Gloucestershire. I think it was a Rogues Gallery.
I see, Rogues Gallery. I just
Gallery.
didn't think what it was.
Hang on, yeah, Victorian Prisoners of Gloucester Jail, a Rogues Gallery. So if anyone has any questions for John, if you can just put your camera on and put your hand up or put something in the chat. You're getting thanks for a good talk, John. Hello, Maureen.
Hi, Maureen.
You're on mute at the moment, Maureen.
Everybody's on mute.
Yeah, so I don't think I can do a group unmute. Let me just have a look.
Thank you, John.
Hi, Maureen, how you doing? You okay?
I'm okay.
Good,
How
good.
about you?
Yeah, not too bad. Not too
Good.
bad at all, thanks. I'll be back in the archives soon. With a bit of luck.
So did anyone have anything that they wanted to ask? Just looking, it doesn't look like it. Just wait and see if anybody's going to put anything in the chat.
Sound of my voice. Cut people to the bone.
Okay, well, it looks as if it's it's time for us to finish anyway. So well done, John. That was fantastic. So the next one will be the third Wednesday in April, and as John said, it's going to be about poorhouses. What was the title of it again, John?
The poor are always with us.
Poor are always with us.
Paraphrasing Jesus's, I think it was Jesus's statement. I think. I don't know my Bible, I'm afraid. So yeah, again, if you look all looking at sort of like poor relief, we've got some great documents there. My favourite is Savage's Wench, which is a good one. So it should be a really interesting one. That'll be delivered by Gemma because I'm away in sunny Spain for that week, believe it or not. Well, I think it will be, hopefully, if we don't get COVID again. So yeah, but it'll be a really good one. And of course, the passport to the past, the family events will be before that. And again, all about growing up in wartime, and that's there. I think who have you got talking about that one?
Oh, Judy Kimber. One of our volunteers.
That one about her wartime experiences, which is great. So, and I'll throw in some of the ones that my mum told me when she was growing up in the wartime in Gloucester, Long Nevans as well. So please do.
Okay, so that's it then. Thank you very much for coming, everybody, and hope we'll see you again for the next one on the third Wednesday in April. Bye.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Bye.